Then,
Thank you.
okay, yeah, welcome. Okay, we can start. Others will join like the other day.
Okay. Okay. Good morning, Sandra. Good morning, uh, all of our guests. My name is Jojo Labenko, and I'm a project manager. I started about 5 years ago. And Sandra found me on Instagram and said, "Hey, why don't we collaborate? I'll find the audience, and you all just share with them what you have already learned, and maybe we'll get this thing going." So this is, I think, our third session together.
Yes, third section.
Nice. And today we will be talking about task prioritization for project managers. You'll give me just one. Oh, can you please give me
Oh,
a screen sharing
yeah. I
privilege?
I forgot. Yeah, I forgot to do that. Sorry.
No problems.
Okay, now you can.
Thank you so much. Oh, 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 all right. Please let me know if you can see my screen.
Yes, we can see it.
Awesome. So today's topic is tasks prioritization for project managers. We're going to take a look at why is task prioritization important. This may or may not be trivial for some of us. Then we'll establish a few ground rules. We'll take a look at what revisions need to be made along the way to make sure that priority remains useful to you. Then we'll go over a few examples and wrap it up with a summary page, and that's when I'll take the questions. So, why is task prioritization important? First and foremost, we live and work in the real world where resources are finite, nothing is infinite, and people, money, and materials. So, we really need to take a look at all the tasks that we have associated with our project and assign them numbers of priority. What is number one, number two, number three, and then so on. The reasons for doing that are focus and productivity. So instead of having your team jump straight to executing tasks one, two, and three at the same time, maybe it's worth focusing all effort on task number one before moving on to number two, and so on. So fairly straightforward, but I wanted to cover these basics to make sure that we're on the same page. Then, why else task prioritization is important? A very important factor is that whatever kind of work we do it for someone. So, project stakeholders, often clients, are, and not only clients, also your teammates, they expect some kind of certainty once they have a project manager. So they're looking for guidance on what to do next. And when you can clearly prioritize tasks, you can assign, okay, John is doing task number one, Sarah is doing task number two, but Sam doesn't start with task number three until both John and Sarah complete their tasks. So stakeholder satisfaction comes into play. Certainly, when you can tell people what to do, when to do, they'll figure out how, but then you have a plan. You have something to gauge your performance of. And of course, last but not least, as I mentioned before, our resources are constrained. They are finite: time, people, materials. And if you don't have infinite budget, which is almost always the case, and you don't have infinite labor power, which also is usually the case, then you really have to take a strong look at your project and make sure that the resources that you need are the ones that you have and in which order they should go and execute work. Now, how do you go about prioritizing tasks? Uh, and that's what the ground rules section should cover. Tasks need to be first and foremost aligned with project goals. Let's say I'm going to keep using the same example because I think most people can imagine it in their minds, and it doesn't take too much professional knowledge to kind of understand the steps. And it's a building a house. So the goal of your project is to build a home. Now, which tasks have the highest value? It depends on where you are in the project. So if you are in the very beginning, first you have to clear off the land. You need to chop down the trees and level out ground. That is your number one. If you were to start building walls around the trees and then cut the trees off and then take them from over the walls and out through the roof, well, you're going to spend a ton of time and effort, and it's just unnecessary. Why doing that if you can start by clearing out the trees, leveling out the ground, and then pouring concrete? So at that time, in the very beginning of the project, the most valuable task is creating the foundation for the home. So that's what you need to focus on, as opposed to all the following ones. And of course, once the foundation is created, well, what's the next most important thing? You need to raise your walls, right? And then you need to put up your roof. At that time, building walls and securing the roof become the most valuable tasks, and they need to be addressed. You need to take all of your professionals that know what they're doing and focus their work explicitly on that. um, Not have them go around the yard and putting up a fence or getting ready to bring in the wallpapers or drywall to start creating the interior. That's too early. You have to focus their effort on raising the walls and putting up the roof, and so on and so forth. Then, of course, once you are going through the project, assessing and reassessing your tasks is also extremely important. And we're going to talk about subtleties here a little bit. Now, we'll talk about it more in examples. But let's say your number one task on building this home, after some time has passed and you have raised the walls and you put up the roof and you put in the windows and the doors, and now you have your floors laid down, and uh, rain starts, and it starts raining and you can see water leaking through the roof on the interior of the house. Well, should you still continue doing electrical work and putting in plumbing and the interior doors? No. You need to stop everything and you need to prioritize fixing the roof. That's why you may have a project plan, and you may have something to go off of, your critical path, the chain of events that need to happen to get to the end. But every now and then, you need to take a step back, take a hard look, and reassess. Well, okay, I know that on the schedule it says that we will be putting in sinks and kitchen counters today, but the roof is leaking. So everyone stop everything and let's go fix the roof. Of course, you need to adjust those tasks as needed. Third point is you need to balance short and long term objectives, partly because it's a project. Project is going to have things that last 1 or 2 days, and then some tasks that last um, months. Sometimes collecting permits to build a house can last months on end, but then you get short term documentational goals like inviting an inspector at the very end. So, of course, you don't want to assign a completely separate individual to just collect the permits and continue paying them hourly salary for every day that he is waiting for that permit to be issued. Their job is to go to the right office, put in the correct paperwork, and then wait um, for that permit to be received. So instead of allocating a whole worker to just stand in line and wait until the permit is generated to bring it back, I'll have them do something else. And that's the balancing between long and short term objectives. The revision part of task prioritization is something Just like I said earlier, it needs to be done periodically. Go back to your project plan and look at the tasks. Um, for example, just like with the leaky roof on the house, you had workers doing all kinds of different objectives. Well, everyone stop everything that you're doing. Let's go fix that roof. And this needs to be done periodically, even when there is not any kind of force majeure or out of scope event that's happening. The reason for it is you may not catch your project slipping, but your team is being bogged down. And let's say you didn't have enough resources to complete tasks C and D because everyone is strictly focused on tasks A and B. But you cannot move on any further until all four of these are complete. So you'd have to go in, revise task priority, maybe allocate more folks to task C and D as well. A and B is already going to run late, and then go from there. And of course, your project's critical path will dictate what needs to be done first, second, third, last. But sometimes critical paths change. If, for example, along the way, uh, let's get back to building our home. You realize that you cannot connect electricity to the house for another month because the transformers have long lead times, or you don't have the wires. The wires are in a shipping container, and they will only arrive in 1 month. And that was task number 4. Well, and on the critical path. Just because you don't have permanent electricity in your house doesn't mean that you cannot do work. You just bring a generator over, you throw in some temporary wiring, and then you continue doing interior work. So now your house electrification went from priority number 4 to priority number 9 because you were able to mitigate the change to the project's critical path and just delay completion of this task. You'll get it done, but a little bit later. And in the meantime, you can focus on other tasks that need to be done. And of course, it's difficult to gauge where your project is when people on your team and your customers are not talking, they're not interfacing. So I said it before, and I will continue saying it for you as a project manager. Facilitating communication is key. Quite frankly, if I asked what is one thing that project managers are paid for, that is for facilitating communication between the team that executes the work and the customer. If you do good, your team has to offer. Prioritizing tasks will be a breeze because clients can clearly outline, here's what I expect out of the project. Your team can say, here's how long it's going to take us to get it done. And then it will be your job to take these two inputs and come up with project schedule. And here's an example. Yes, I'm sorry, but we're getting back to building a house. And so, for example, we originally had this priority: foundation, then raising the walls, then doing the interior and roof at the same time, right? So we cleared out the trees, we leveled out the ground, we poured the foundation. Next, we brought in the walls. We raised the walls, and then right after walls, we started doing roof and interior at the same time. Well, news alert, a giant storm is moving in our area, and it's about to rain, I don't know, 40 inches of rain in one day, which is a lot. It's huge. It's monsoon flood. What do you do? Do you continue having folks working on your interior and the roof at the same time? Or do you tell your interior roof workers, stop everything, drop your tools in place, and jump on the roof team to help set up the roof? And the answer kind of speaks for itself. And you can see it over here. Roof becomes the priority. The interior can be done later, but at least you will know that nothing on the inside will get damaged by these torrential floods. And software development world doesn't stop to surprise me. I was a project manager on a few of the software projects, and we had to change things around. Just because I had an amazing team they knew what they were doing, and they were fairly experienced in their system. Everyone with well over a decade working on relatively analogous projects. And the way it usually goes is you do your planning, then you analyze what you've planned, then you start developing your product, test, and then you deploy it. Well, I was also in situations where there was an urgent need for the product. So instead of following the traditional waterfall method, we had to jump into more of an agile framework where we planned and analyzed as we went. And if truth was being told, development and testing should have been also here with planning and analyzing along the way, because we started pulling chunks and pieces of code from previous projects and looking at some of the examples that already existed just to develop our tool and then deploy it to our customer. So, original plan, everything is done in sequence, no rush. Um, your planning team and analysis team is doing their job, then they walk away. Then the dev team and then test team step in and they do what needs to be done to make sure that the product is working. And then it gets handed over to the deployment team. Well, in this case, it was different. And as you can see, the arrows are going in both directions because as we were planning, we were pulling up the old things we were and testers to shape it into somewhat of a functional app, and then they quickly released it to deployment. So, first things first, and bottom line up front, even though it's the end of the presentation, communication was, is, and will remain project manager's key skill. You need to make sure that your clients can accurately describe what it is that they want. And you also need to make sure that your team understands their capabilities and how those capabilities align with customers' expectations. That they may not be directly involved in the process, but they're the ones paying for it or providing upfront investment. You also have to keep them in the loop of what's going on. So it is really, really your job, uh, and it will always be as a project manager to maintain the open line of communication. And of course, you need to go back and systematically reevaluate your task priorities because things change. Nothing stays the same in project management world. We can go from sunny, shiny day in one moment, and a few hours later, clouds roll in, it starts pouring rain and hurricane force winds. Seen it happen. And when you're an agile project manager, you would plan for events like that ahead of the game. So don't only have one plan, think of the worst possible outcome and what it is that you can do to help your team in this situation. But that's really all I had for this presentation. Thank you so much for listening, and I'll be more than happy to answer any of the questions that you may have.
Okay, thank you very much, Joe. You always outdo yourself.
Yeah, my
Thank
pleasure.
you very much. Okay, so Marcus has a question. Okay, you can ask your question. You can unmute yourself and ask.
Uh, am I audible?
Yeah, I can hear you, Marcus.
Okay.
Oh, you're on mute now.
Marcus, can you hear us?
Yeah, I can hear you guys. Can you hear me now?
Yes, we can.
I can hear you.
Okay. So good evening, Joe, and good evening, Sandra. And I want to start by appreciating you guys for see it very important. Organizing this seminar is very, very educative. This brief session kind of
Thank you.
give me some sort of clarity around tax. So mine is not basically direct question. It's just some hints that I need from you. And the first one is
Sure.
within the tech system, especially the software scope, if
Mhm.
you are to break down your projects or you are to define your tasks, what are the hints? How do you go about it? How do you break it down to be very, very like how do you present your tasks in such a way that is well defined and you should be able to know how to go about it? I know we have some platform that try to like dictate that for you, but from your
Mhm.
experience with the software, how do you break your tasks, your project into a task? Then secondly, you mentioned like sometimes there are unplanned circumstance that might arise and you have to like reprioritize your tasks. So is it not the same thing with switching your tasks, which like switching context, which kind of like reduce your productivity? So
Mhm.
yeah, when you have
Absolutely.
plan, why can't you stick to it instead of like switching tasks because circumstance
Yes.
change? So that's all.
No, thank you. Thank you for two great, fairly complex questions, Marcus. I must admit, but I like complicated questions, and hopefully I'll give you an answer that that will help clarify things. So, first, how do you go about breaking down tasks? And it really depends on, of course, a couple of things. One is the type of project that you're working on. Is it something fairly unique, or is that a repeatable process that was done hundreds of times before, and this one is just slightly different? If it is something in either of these cases, I would say if you're not sure, if there's not a template in place already, something tried and true, you should start writing down everything along the way. You come up with your project plan, and as soon as you have it, go to the folks that will be doing the work and try to collect as much data out of them as possible. So, if we're talking about, sorry, building a house, uh, go back to the folks that will be clearing out the land, and you ask them, okay, what kind of equipment are you going to use? How long do you think it will take you? What can go wrong? Those are usually three questions that I always ask my teams. And you write those things down. Okay, great. Then you go to the next team that will be creating the foundation. All right, guys, how much concrete do you need? What is the lead time? How much is it going to cost? What can possibly go wrong? So you write those three things down. On to the team that will raise the walls, and then the team that will put up the roof, and then all your electricians and plumbers and so on. Once you have gathered all that data, the third sentence that you write down, what can go wrong, put all of them together. And based on that, start shuffling your tasks around and coming up with your contingencies, what to do if things don't go your way. And I think that that should give you a pretty good idea on how to prioritize stuff. Because if you realize, for example, pick any task, let's say raising walls. Well, what can go wrong? One of the walls can fall off on its side and break. Okay, what's the consequence of that? Oh, it's going to be terrible because we only order enough wood or concrete or bricks, whatever your walls are made of. We only order enough of them for one project, and then we need to stop all work for 1 month to wait for another load of material until we can start, and so we can continue on our project. Well, obviously, that becomes a very critical task. You need to make sure that that wall will not fall off under any circumstances. Bring in more people, invite some engineers with expertise, make that one a priority, the one that stands out the most, the one that can cause your project to delay the most. Uh, Circle it in red, put a whole bunch of arrows around it, make sure that that gets done. So that is as far as prioritizing tasks. And what was the second part to your question? I'm sorry.
Like regarding switching context, You mentioned like there are some circumstances that you need to reprioritize your tasks. So is that
Yes.
not the same thing with switching context? Won't it be counterproductive?
Yes. And that will become more. So you go around switching priorities when you realize that resources that are available to you is not enough, and your project is destined to fail if you continue following the same track. Uh, it's you're doing something in some kind of work. You have team A, team B, and team C. Team A is working on task A, team B is supposed to work on task B, and team C is working on task C, obviously. They all can get finished independently, and I really wish that I had a whiteboard that I could draw on right now. But I don't think that we have that tool included in here. Maybe next time. And they can all finish independently, but you still have to deliver both A, B, and C products. Halfway along the way, you realize that product B is not going to be done on time. So, what do you do? And that exactly kind of weighs into your comment of, well, do you choose to implement a change and flex some, grab a couple workers, experts from task A and put them on task B to hopefully finish it sooner? Or do you accept the risk? Do you accept the fact task B will not be done one way after, and you just let it slide? You inform the customer, sorry, we're not going to be done on time because of, you obviously list the reasons, but here's what we're doing to make sure that on this new date we will finish. And then you change nothing. Stick to the plan, let the team do what they need to do. I had to do that many, many times. Just actually, this week I had a conversation with one of my project teams. They're falling behind about 6 months, but they're working on something that is very, very unique and is not really commonly available on the market. They're creating a fairly unique product for a very unique customer. And that's what I had to do. I wrote down the reasons what's slowing us down. We discussed what are we going to do to make sure that on this new completion date it will be delivered. And with these findings, I went to the customer. I had to disappoint them, but I was upfront and honest that this is what's happening. We're not, of course, we're not going to charge you anymore, and we apologize for the delay. But here are the reasons, and here's what we're doing to make sure that it will get delivered on time. Now, the project is not due until December, and we're telling them that it will be delivered in March. So there is still a hope that things will work out in our way, and we'll actually get to finish it in December. But I always under promise and over deliver, kind of reduce the expectations instead of promising people, that we'll able to take the moon off the sky and give it to you. No, tell them that we're slow and sluggish, but we will get the work done. And then, of course, if you can finish earlier and surprise your customer in a good way, when that's acceptable, because sometimes they would rather have it later than earlier because they need to get some work done on their end, and then certainly do that. And if you can pull off things like this, and the more often you do it as a project manager, the more often you had to go to the customer and explain these complicated situations, the better you will become at task prioritization. Because you're 100% right, Marcus. Sometimes deviating from the plan can cause even further slowdowns, but there is no way of knowing it unless you've done it before. You can have a perfect plan, perfect risk analysis that shows, yep, I just need to drop this one task and I'll get there faster. Real life happens, there's more delays, and that's why I encourage everyone to get good at communicating. But hopefully that answers your question.
Yeah, it does. Thank you very much. That's all from my own end.
My pleasure.
Okay, any more questions? Thank you very much, Marcus, for that question. I I personally learned one or two from the question. And thank you very much, Joe, for answering the question.
My pleasure.
Okay, so any other question from anybody? Okay, and you can actually
Alrighty.
write in the comment section if you do not want to ask. Okay, Lawrence, can you hear us? Lawrence, can you hear us?
Oh, Sandra, yes, I can hear you.
Okay, I just want to be sure. You don't have any question, you understood the whole section perfectly.
Yeah, that's it was quite useful.
Okay, and I don't know, but I'm going to call you by the name of your phone, Samsung. Do you have any question? You can unmute yourself and answer.
Or you can
Oh,
always use the chat, and if not, that's okay too. I really appreciate you guys coming today.
I've done that now.
sorry, we
All
didn't
right.
hear that.
Hello?
Did you? Yeah, we can hear you.
Okay. My question is that since I've paid for the app, now they have increased payment, then I can't able to reach more of it again. That's the issue I'm having. But I'm kind of busy, so I cannot even chat and talk to you. That's why.
I don't.
So we should talk on after the program.
Yes, there'll be a recording. Like I'm recording it, so I'm going to drop the recording in the group chat.
Okay. Okay.
Yes, I'll drop the recording there. Okay, thank you very
Well,
much.
thank you.
Okay, thank you very much, Joe. I think that's all. And I really appreciate this. I appreciate you making out time every Friday, aside from last week. And like you said, this is like the third section. And yeah, thank you to everybody that has been coming through. Yes, thank you very much. So without wasting our time any further, I think this is where we draw the curtains for today. Like I said, I will have the recording dropped in the group and I'll send it across to you, Joe, as well, like I did the last time.
Thank you so much, Sandra. And thank you to all of our guests for coming today. And Mr. Marcus, thank you so much for really good questions. I really enjoyed talking to you.
Yeah. Okay. So without wasting more time, thank you very much, Joe, and good night from our end.
Thank you so much. Good night to everyone, and see you next week.
Yeah, bye. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Bye bye.